The courthouse had always stood as a reminder of the town's sense of order. Built nearly a century ago, its stone walls were weathered by rain and sun, and its tall windows caught the morning light like lenses, spilling gold onto the worn steps. Outside, the courthouse bell had rung promptly at 9, echoing across the small community, summoning jurors, clerks, and townspeople with its steady voice. Inside, the air was heavy, not from heat, but from expectation. The long wooden benches that lined the courtroom creaked beneath the weight of farmers in pressed shirts, business owners in wrinkled jackets, and mothers tugging along children who couldn't be left at home. A murmur of conversation ebbed and flowed like waves in the ocean-low voices, sharp whispers. A cough here and there all cut short whenever the bailiff's polished shoes clicked across the floor. At the front, the judge's bench rose above the room like a pulpit. Behind it, the flag of the United States hung, its colors muted in the morning light, alongside the state flag, slightly more faded from years of sunlight streaming through the same windows. Every detail of the room carried a seriousness that pressed upon the shoulders of those inside. Court was not a place of play. It was a stage where lives could change in an instant. The cases on the docket weren't extraordinary petty theft, property disputes, and a much-anticipated testimony in a local burglary case, but for the people present, each hearing was serious, even personal. Farmers had left their fields unattended. Shopkeepers had closed their stores for the morning, and somewhere among them sat individuals who knew their testimonies, or their silence, might tip the scales of justice. Then the door at the side of the courtroom opened, and the atmosphere shifted. A pair of officers entered, crisp in their uniforms, badges polished until they caught the light. Between them walked Rex, the courthouse's most famous presence. A German shepherd of remarkable size and stature, Rex carried himself with calm authority. His coat gleamed with shades of black and tan, and his movements were smooth, measured, almost ceremonial. The leash in the handler's hand was more of a formality. Everyone knew Rex needed no reminding of his duty. The murmurs hushed, as though someone had pressed a pause button on the entire room. Conversations stopped mid-word. Even the restless children craned their necks to see him. Rex was not just a dog, he was a symbol. Over the years, stories about him had spread through the town like folklore. Some said he had once tracked a suspect for miles through pouring rain. Others claimed he had sniffed out evidence that human officers had overlooked. And though not every story could be proven, one fact remained unshaken. Rex never wavered. In the presence of this dog, people felt both safe and humbled. Near the back of the room, a young mother sat with her 3-year-old son perched on her lap. She looked slightly out of place among the stern adults, her hands busy keeping the boy still. His small shoes tapped against the bench, his fingers drummed restlessly, and his bright eyes searched every corner of the room with unrestrained curiosity. Unlike the adults, he had no sense of why the place felt heavy. To him, the courthouse wasn't a stage for justice. It was just another big room filled with people and strange sounds. But then he saw Rex. The boy's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His restless fidgeting stopped, his tapping feet stilled, and his small body leaned forward. His gaze fixed on the German shepherd, as if the rest of the world had vanished. His mother followed his eyes and sighed, whispering, "Stay still, Liam. Just sit quietly for Mommy, okay?" But her son barely heard her. To Liam, Rex was not an officer's tool, not a disciplined canine on duty. He was simply a dog, a big, brave, magnificent dog. And Liam adored him instantly. At the front, Rex's handler gave the briefest nod to the judge, who acknowledged him with a glance. The canine took his position with practiced precision, lowering himself into a sit that radiated focus. His ears were upright, his eyes scanning the room with the soldier's discipline. No movement startled him, no sound shook him. He was the definition of composure. People respected Rex, but they also feared breaking his discipline. Children were told not to shout near him. Adults whispered that even sudden movements might be taken as a sign of threat. The entire town seemed to understand the silent rule. Rex was not to be treated as a pet, no matter how much they wanted to reach out and ruffle his fur. And so, as the judge cleared his throat and court was called to order, all eyes reluctantly shifted away from the dog. The hum of papers, the echo of formal words, and the steady rhythm of procedure returned. But in the back, Liam still stared, his tiny chest rising and falling in excitement. He was too young to know the rules, too innocent to understand. Weight of discipline. To him, silence was not reverence. It was simply a chance to be heard. As the judge began outlining the first case, people leaned forward, pens ready, faces stern. Yet the boy remained fixed on Rex, watching every flick of his ear, every shift of his paw. His mother kept one hand on his shoulder, gently pressing him down when he leaned too far forward. Still, the pull between boy and dog was undeniable, a thread woven in the quiet space between them. The officers near the door noticed it too. One leaned toward the other and whispered, "Kid's got his eyes glued on Rex." The other officer smirked, but didn't turn his head. Happens. All the time. Rex never breaks. Kid'll get bored soon enough. But Liam wasn't bored. He was waiting. The boy had already decided in his heart that the dog was listening to him, even if no one else believed it. He didn't care that the judge spoke in a tone that carried authority, or that the adults around him looked as though every word mattered. For Liam, the only thing that mattered was Rex. The dog was special, and he wanted Rex to know that he knew. And so, as the courthouse continued its careful march of justice, a moment was building quietly, invisibly, yet inevitably. No one could have predicted it, but that morning, in a room full of laws and consequences, it would not be a lawyer's argument or a judge's ruling that people remembered. It would be the unshaken gaze of a 3-year-old and the extraordinary bond he was about to spark with a dog who never broke discipline. The courthouse gathering had begun like countless others, full of formality, order, and stern expectation, but before long, it would be remembered for something far more human. Something that reminded everyone present of a truth they often forgot, that innocence has power, and sometimes the simplest gestures carry the greatest weight. The silence stretched, the clock ticked, and Liam leaned forward one last time, his lips parting with a secret he was about to share with Rex, a secret that would change the room. The reputation of Rex was not born overnight. It was forged through years of training, discipline, and countless moments where his steadiness had meant the difference between chaos and control. In the county courthouse that morning, everyone who sat on those benches knew his name, even if they had never spoken to his handler or touched the thick coat of fur that gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. Rex was more than a dog. He was a guardian of order. When he walked into the courtroom, his steps were soundless against the polished floor. His handler, Officer Daniels, a tall man with a squared jaw and the kind of posture that made people instinctively stand straighter, barely tugged on the leash. He didn't need to. Rex walked as though the leash was unnecessary, as though his loyalty was tether enough. The people watched him not with the easy smiles they gave pets, but with the wary reverence reserved for soldiers. They had heard the stories. There was the night when the alarm went off at the jewelry store on Main Street. By the time officers arrived, the thief was already gone, slipping into the rainy darkness. It was Rex who picked up the scent and followed it for nearly 2 miles, weaving through alleyways slick with rain, across muddy fields, until he cornered the suspect beneath an abandoned shed. When the officers arrived, The man was too terrified to move, pinned in place by nothing more than Rex's steady gaze and low growl. Another story involved the old courthouse itself. Years back, during a high-profile trial, tensions had run so high that shouts erupted between family members of the accused and the victims. People said Rex had stood at the front, motionless, his gaze locked on the crowd, and the noise had fallen into silence. Not a bark, not a lunge, just the weight of his presence quieted the room in a way no gavel could dot. So when Rex entered that morning, people felt it. They straightened. They hushed. And though they wanted to, no one dared reach out a hand to scratch. Behind his ears, from his seat, Judge Harper observed the K-9 with the familiarity of someone who had seen him dozens of times before. Harper was not an easy man to impress. He had presided over 30 years of cases, some light-hearted, others tragic. Yet even he admitted privately to colleagues that Rex was unlike any animal he had ever encountered. That dog he had once, said during chambers, has more composure than half the lawyers who walk through these doors. The bailiff, a stout man named Miller, shared a similar respect. He often joked to jurors during orientation, "You'll notice Rex in the room. Don't worry, he doesn't bite unless you plan to run. And trust me, you won't get far." The laughter was always nervous, but it worked. It reminded people that Rex was not there to be admired, but to serve. Yet for all his reputation, Rex was not unfeeling. Those who worked closest to him knew that beneath the discipline lay a heart as loyal as any companion's. Officer Daniels, his handler, was the only one who truly saw both sides, the stoic guardian and the affectionate friend. At home, Rex was known to nudge Daniels' hand when he wanted an extra treat or lay his head against his handler's knee during quiet evenings. But in public, and especially in court, Rex transformed. The softness vanished, replaced by unwavering duty. That was why, on that morning, when Liam's small eyes followed Rex with unwavering focus, no one expected anything unusual to happen. Rex was predictable in his discipline. He didn't flinch at the scraping of chairs, the loud clearing of throats, or the occasional cries of babies dragged into courtrooms by mothers with no other choice. He was the picture of restraint. Still, the stories lingered in people's minds as they glanced at him. A woman in the second row leaned to her neighbor and whispered, "That's the one they call the uncheckable, right?" Her neighbor nodded. "Never breaks. They say he once ignored firecrackers going off right beside him. Didn't even blink." The woman raised her brows, impressed. "Makes you wonder if he's more human than dog." Up near the front, one of the defense attorneys glanced back at Rex with a wry smile. He had been in enough trials with the K-9 to know how jurors reacted. Subtly, Rex's presence worked in the prosecution's favor. Jurors associated his calm authority with trustworthiness, as though the dog himself could smell guilt. "I'll never get used to arguing my case with him watching me," the attorney muttered under his breath, flipping through his notes. But Rex wasn't watching him. His eyes scanned the room evenly, not lingering too long on anyone, as though reading the unspoken tension in the air. His tail remained still, his body poised but not stiff. To those who knew K-9 training, it was clear. Rex was in a state of readiness, alert but calm, as if waiting for a command that might never come. Children, especially, were drawn to him. Parents in the audience often had to tug their little ones back when Rex passed by in the hallway, reminding them that he wasn't like the neighbor's Labrador or the family beagle. He wasn't there for pats or playful games of fetch. But children never quite understood. They only saw the noble lines of his body, the strength in his stance, and the intelligence shining in his eyes. That morning, Liam was no different. He didn't know the stories of thieves caught or trials subdued. He didn't know about the years of training sessions in open fields, the endless repetitions of sit, stay, heel. What he knew was simpler. There was a dog, and the dog was magnificent. Mother tried to distract him with a small bag of crackers she had tucked into her purse. "Here, Liam, snack quietly," she whispered, nudging the bag into his hands. But Liam didn't take it. His little voice came out in a whisper instead, soft but certain. "Mommy, look, doggy." "Yes, sweetheart," she murmured quickly, glancing nervously at the officers, but he's working. Working. It was a word Liam didn't understand. To him, a dog was a dog. And if you saw a dog, you told him he was good. That was how it worked in his 3-year-old world. The court carried on, unaware of the quiet storm building in the back row. The prosecutor rose to present evidence. The defense prepared objections, and the judge listened with that practiced neutrality carved by years of experience. To them, the case was everything. To Liam, the dog was everything. And so, even as the K-9's reputation loomed over the room, keeping adults at bay with the weight of discipline, one child felt no such restraint. He had no stories in his head, no warnings on his tongue. He saw, not the unshakable legend, but simply a friend who deserved to hear the words that had been sitting on his small lips from the moment Rex entered. Rex, the unbreakable, had never wavered. But reputations are only as strong as the moments they are tested. And this morning, his test would not come from a fleeing suspect or a shouting mob. It would come from the innocent honesty of a 3-year-old. The courtroom ticked on. The clock, marking seconds that led closer to the moment that would etch itself into every memory present. Rex sat, poised and steady, the embodiment of his reputation. But even legends, as everyone was about to witness, could be touched by something far greater than discipline. The boy was small, so small that the wooden bench seemed far too big for him. His feet didn't touch the ground, dangling freely as he shifted back and forth, restless against his mother's arm. At just 3 years old, Liam was not meant for quiet rooms filled with stern faces. He was meant for playgrounds and storybooks, for chasing butterflies across backyards, and laughing at things adults no longer found funny. But circumstances left his mother with no choice that day, and so Liam was here, in a courthouse where silence was expected and patience was demanded. His mother, Claire, knew the challenge the moment they walked through the heavy doors. She had prayed her little boy would sit still, prayed the bag of snacks and crayons she had packed would be enough to keep him occupied. But children did not bend easily to prayers or to rules written in the margins of adult life. Liam's energy was boundless, his curiosity endless. She smoothed his soft brown hair with a weary hand and whispered, "Please, sweetheart, try to sit still, just for a little while." Liam didn't answer. His wide hazel eyes were darting around the room, drinking in the sea of strangers, the towering ceilings, the stern man in black robes at the front. But none of these held his attention for long. His gaze landed on Rex, and the world stopped. Moving to Liam, the dog was a wonder. He had seen dogs before neighbors' mutts, who barked too much, the playful spaniel his grandmother kept, even the scrappy strays that sometimes wandered near the alley by their apartment. But this dog was different. Rex didn't bounce or wag or sniff the ground. He stood tall, proud, his eyes sharp like the heroes Liam saw in cartoons. To the boy, Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a knight. The longer Liam stared, the more the restless fidgeting in his body stilled. His small hands, which had been drumming against the bench, went quiet. His tapping shoes stopped. His entire little frame leaned forward, balanced on the edge of the seat, as though the slightest shift might draw him closer to the magnificent creature at the front of the room. Claire noticed the change immediately. For a fleeting moment, she felt relief. If Rex was enough to hold her son's attention, then perhaps, just perhaps, they might survive this long morning without incident. She brushed a crumb from her lap and whispered, "You see the doggy. Liam? He's working right now. That means we don't talk to him. Okay? We just look." But Liam only tilted his head, eyes never leaving Rex. His lips parted slightly, as if forming words he didn't dare speak just yet. To a child, silence is not reverence, it is anticipation. The courtroom around them buzzed with adult concerns. Attorneys shuffled papers, jurors shifted in their seats, and the judge scribbled notes with the concentration of someone long accustomed to formality. Conversations whispered in corners, pens tapped against clipboards, the air filled with the low hum of law in motion. But for Liam, all of it faded into the background. There was only Rex, bathed in the pale light streaming through the tall windows, a figure of calm in a world too big for him to understand. The boy studied the way Rex sat, his back straight, his ears perked. He noticed how the dog didn't flinch at noises that made other children jump. Even when someone coughed loudly from the front row, Rex didn't so much as turn his head. Liam's little mind tried to puzzle it out. How does he stay so still? He thought, doesn't he get bored? Doesn't he want to play? The question swirled, but no answer came. Instead, something else began to rise inside him. Admiration. His 3-year-old heart swelled with it. He wanted Rex to know he was special. He wanted Rex to know that someone in the room saw more than just a working dog. Claire, sensing the intensity of her son's gaze, tried again to distract him. She pulled a small pack of crayons from her purse and slid a notepad into his lap. "Here, sweetie, draw me a picture. Picture of the dog, maybe." "You love to draw." But Liam shook his head. Drawing wasn't enough. Paper couldn't capture the feeling blooming in his chest. He needed Rex to hear him. "Not now," Claire murmured firmly, mistaking his restlessness for stubbornness. "Please." "Liam, not here." Her voice held that quiet edge of desperation every parent knows, the kind that pleads not just with the child, but with fate itself. Still, Liam leaned forward again. He was patient, but not in the way adults understood. His patience was not silence. It was readiness. He was waiting for the right moment, the perfect second when the dog might glance his way, when their eyes might meet. Unbeknownst to his mother, Liam had already decided what he would say. In his tiny vocabulary, there were few words he trusted. Few words he felt carried the weight of truth. But 2 of them were enough, 2 words that, in his world, meant everything. 2 words that he had said countless times to his grandmother's spaniel. Words that made the dog's tail wag and his eyes brighten with pride. Words that expressed love, recognition, and pure affection. Good boy. The thoughts sat on his lips like a secret, warm and insistent. He didn't yet know when he would say it, but he knew he must. Because in Liam's eyes, Rex deserved nothing less. The rest of the courtroom, unaware of the boy's silent decision, carried on. The judge cleared his throat and instructed the jurors, "Allow your Rose to deliver her opening argument." Her voice precise, clipped with practiced authority. The sound of her words echoed through the tall chamber, demanding attention. Yet even her commanding tone could not pry Liam's gaze from the German shepherd. The officers at the side of the room noticed the boy, too. One leaned down to Daniels, Rex's handler, and muttered quietly, "Kid in the back won't stop staring at your partner." Daniels gave the faintest smile, but didn't turn his head. Happens all the time. Rex is used to it. And it was true. Dozens of children had stared at Rex before, their eyes wide, their mouths open in awe. But most were pulled away before anything could come of it. Parents knew the rules. Canine South weren't pets. Rex wasn't there to entertain, but Liam's stare was different. It was unblinking, unwavering, filled not just with curiosity, but with something deeper, something harder to ignore. And if Rex noticed, and perhaps he did, he gave no sign. The German shepherd remained motionless. The perfect image of composure. Claire shifted in her seat again, brushing her hand over Liam's hair. "Almost done, sweetheart," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't true. They had hours yet. Hours of sitting, waiting, listening. Hours her son could hardly endure. But Liam wasn't restless anymore. Not in the way she feared. His entire world had narrowed to the dog at the front of the room, and the words he carried inside him like a secret. When the time came, he would speak them. Quietly, perhaps, or loudly, he hadn't decided. But he knew he would say them, and when he did, the dog would understand. Children live in a world of certainty. For them, love is absolute, trust is immediate, and words hold magic. To Liam, good boy was not just praise. It was a gift. It was a key to a bond he felt waiting, unseen. Between himself and Rex. The courtroom clock ticked steadily above the judge's bench, marking seconds that passed unnoticed by most. But for Liam, each tick was a countdown. Each moment brought him closer to the decision he had already made. And so, as the adults busied themselves with matters of law, unaware of the quiet child in the back row, a different kind of trial was being prepared, not one of guilt or innocence, but one of heart. Soon, in the silence of the courthouse, the boy would lean forward, his small voice breaking the weight of discipline with two simple words. And nothing in that room would ever be quite the same. The courtroom had settled into its rhythm, that strange mechanical heartbeat of law and procedure. The judge's gavel had struck earlier, and since then the room had been an orchestra of voices and papers, all playing in rigid harmony. Lawyers spoke in measured tones, their words calculated for persuasion. Jurors listened, pens scratching across notepads. Every cough, every shuffle of feet seemed magnified in the cavernous chamber. At the front, Rex remained the immovable sentinel. His body was a study in discipline. Shoulders squared, eyes sharp, posture balanced perfectly between readiness and restraint. The polished leather leash in Officer Daniels's hand looked more symbolic than necessary. Rex didn't need restraint. His composure was his leash. The German shepherd seemed impervious to distraction. Pen dropped loudly onto the tile floor. He didn't flinch. A chair scraped as someone shifted uncomfortably. His ears twitched, but he remained still. Even when a baby cried briefly from the back row before being hurried outside, Rex's focus did not waver. He was, as always, the unshakable. But in the back corner of the room, Liam had reached his breaking point, not the restless, fidgeting kind his mother had feared, but the quiet, resolute kind of a child who has decided he cannot keep a secret any longer. For nearly half an hour, Liam had watched the dog in silence. He had studied every flicker of Rex's ears, every blink of his amber eyes. His small body had leaned so far forward on the bench that Claire had pulled him back several times, whispering, "Sit still, sweetheart, please." But nothing, not crayons, not snacks, not whispered promises of treats, later could distract him from the magnetic pull at the front of the room. Finally, as the prosecutor adjusted her papers and cleared her throat, Liam felt the moment arrive. It wasn't dramatic in his mind. It wasn't planned. It was simply necessary. He had a truth to speak, and children do not hold truths inside for long. He leaned forward again, his little chest expanding with a breath, his lips parting. His mother sensed the movement, her hand instinctively pressing against his arm. Liam," she whispered desperately. But it was too late. The boy's voice, high and clear in the silence, rang out with two words. "Good boy." The phrase was soft by adult standards, no louder than the reading voice of a child. But in the acoustics of the courtroom, where silence was king and every sound carried, it was unmistakable. The words leapt into the air, echoing briefly before settling over the crowd like a dropped pebble rippling across still water. 4. A split second, no one moved. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence, eyes flicking up from her notes. Jurors turned their heads, startled, their pens hovering uselessly over paper. The defense attorney glanced around with irritation, then followed the direction of others' gazes toward the back. Even the judge, pen in hand, paused in his writing, the nib of his fountain pen leaving a tiny dot of ink on the paper. All eyes sought the source. Claire's face flushed crimson as she gripped Liam's shoulders. "Oh no," she breathed, mortified. She tried to shush him, pressing a finger to her lips, but her son only blinked back at her with wide, innocent eyes. He didn't understand why everyone had stopped. He had only said what was true. Why shouldn't the dog be told he was a good boy? The weight of the room shifted to the front, to Rex. For a heartbeat, he remained motionless, the legend everyone expected. Then, like a thread snapping, the facade broke. His ears perked sharply, swiveling toward the sound. His head tilted ever so slightly, as though he had been waiting his whole life to hear those exact words in this exact place. And then came the moment no one could have predicted. The dog's tail moved. First a twitch, then a slow, deliberate wag that brushed the floor. His mouth opened slightly, revealing the faintest hint of a canine smile, and a soft whine escaped. His throat gentle, almost questioning, but filled with unmistakable warmth. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. It wasn't loud, but it was collective, a shared intake of breath from nearly every spectator, as though they had all witnessed something sacred. Rex had broken. The dog who had faced gunfire without flinching, who had stood guard through chaos and noise, who had ignored dozens of shouting children in the past, he had responded. And not just to anyone. To a 3-year-old boy in the back row, whose voice carried no authority, no command, only pure affection. The silence stretched. People didn't know whether to laugh, to speak, or to pretend it hadn't happened. The attorneys glanced at one another, unsure whether to object or allow the interruption to dissolve naturally. The judge lowered his pen slowly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in quiet disbelief. Claire, mortified, leaned close to Liam and whispered frantically, "Sweetheart, no talking. You can't talk here. Do you understand? Not now." But Liam wasn't listening. To her, he was watching Rex, his little face lighting up with delight. The dog had heard him. The dog had answered. And for a child, that was magic enough to fill the world. The moment lingered like suspended time, delicate and fragile. No one dared break it, not even Officer Daniels. The seasoned handler had seen his partner resist temptations far greater than this, and yet here was proof that Rex was not a machine. He was flesh, blood, and heart. Daniels's lips twitched into a reluctant smile. He didn't tug the leash, didn't scold. He simply allowed it to be. It was unplanned. It was unorthodox. But it was real. Slowly, the normal rhythm of the courtroom began to stir again. The prosecutor cleared her throat, attempting to mask her own smile as she looked down at her notes. The jurors shifted back into their seats, though some exchanged amused glances. Even the judge, still holding his pen above paper, let the faintest smirk tug at the corners of his lips before he schooled his expression back into neutrality. Yet nothing was quite the same. The air had shifted. Where there had been only tension and formality, there now lingered a softness, reminder that beneath the black robes, polished shoes, and stern words, there was room for innocence. Rex lowered his head slightly, ears still tilted toward the back row, as though keeping Liam in his awareness, even as silence reclaimed the courtroom. His tail stilled again, but the memory of its wag remained stamped in the minds of everyone present. Claire sat stiffly, her heart pounding in her chest. She stroked Liam's hair with trembling fingers, half in an effort to calm him, half to anchor herself. "Please, no more," she whispered. But her son only leaned against her arm, satisfied, his smile bright with the glow of a mission completed. He had said what needed saying. The rest didn't matter. And though the proceedings stumbled back into motion, the people in that courtroom carried something with them, something fragile, something human. They had witnessed the unplanned moment when discipline met innocence, when reputation yielded to love, and when a child's voice touched what rules could not. It would not be the lawyer's arguments that lingered in memory, nor the evidence laid neatly on the table. It would be the small voice of a boy, 2 simple words, and the wag of a tail that answered them. The moment lingered in the courtroom, like smoke after a small fire. Liam's tiny voice had barely carried across the polished floor, yet its effect was seismic. "Good boy," he had said, and the legend of Rex the unshakable canine had faltered, wagging his tail and letting out a soft, almost reverent whine. The unthinkable had happened, and now every adult in the room was forced to process it. Gasps erupted simultaneously, quiet but unmistakable. Some were drawn in astonishment. Others were restrained attempts to maintain decorum. A kind of shock that ripples outward quietly, yet cannot be contained. A juror pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. Did that just happen?" she whispered to her neighbor. The neighbor, a middle-aged farmer with a gray-streaked beard, nodded, his jaw slack. I think it did. I've never seen him do that." He glanced toward Rex, who remained in the front, tail still wagging, eyes focused on Liam, as though the boy had unlocked a secret the world had never known. Even the lawyers froze. The defense attorney, caught mid-note, looked incredulous, his pen hovering above paper. Did the dog just respond to the kid?" he muttered under his breath, forgetting for a moment the strict rules of courtroom etiquette. His colleague, the prosecutor, tilted her head, eyes narrowing as she tried to mask a grin. The opening, arguments, the case strategy, they all felt trivial in that instant. The judge, Judge Harper, remained seated, pen paused mid-stroke. Normally calm and collected, he now blinked several times, taking in the scene like a man witnessing an unusual miracle. His brows knitted together, not in anger, but in disbelief. He had presided over this courthouse for over 30 years, seen every type of human emotion, every dramatic outburst. Yet nothing had ever stopped him mid-sentence like this. He cleared his throat, a deliberate sound meant to regain authority, but it fell strangely flat. Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that familiar gravitas. "We will continue proceedings shortly. However," he paused, swallowing, unsure how to follow. "It appears we have witnessed a unique interaction." The words sounded awkward even to his own ears, but the room was too stunned to laugh. Claire, Liam's mother, sat frozen in the back, cheeks burning red. She had been mortified the moment he spoke. Now, seeing the reaction ripple across the room, her mortification deepened. Her hands flew to his small shoulders. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "no more talking. Please, stop." But Liam, oblivious to adult propriety, leaned back against her arm, eyes sparkling with pride. He had achieved his purpose. Rex had heard him. Rex had responded. And in his mind, that was enough. Officer Daniels, standing at the front with the leash loosely held in his hand, allowed a small smile to tug at his lips. Years of training, countless missions, countless hours spent ensuring Rex remained disciplined in every environment. And here was proof of something few people could ever witness, that even the most unwavering guardian had a heart capable of responding to pure innocence. The dog's reaction continued subtly, but unmistakably. Tail wagged gently, ears flicked toward the boy repeatedly, and the soft whine had not stopped. Daniels glanced down at him, eyes meeting Rex's. A nod passed between them, silent, mutual. Understanding. The dog had acknowledged the moment. It had chosen connection over routine. Around the room, the whispers began. They started quietly, between jurors and observers. "Did you see that?" "I can't believe it." He actually responded. Slowly, the room's atmosphere began to shift. Where tension had been, curiosity and amazement now took root. Adults leaned forward in their seats, forgetting for a moment the stern rules of courtroom behavior. Even the defense attorney, usually quick to assert dominance, relaxed, half-smiling. He whispered to his colleague, "I don't care about this case anymore. That was something else." The prosecutor, her lips pressed together to maintain composure, nodded slightly. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. The judge's assistant, a young clerk who had seen countless trials, whispered to her neighbor, "I've never seen the room react like this, ever." Outside the back door, a small janitor paused in his sweeping, unsure if he should enter. He had been passing the room when the moment occurred, and heard the soft whine of the canine echo through the hallway. "What in the world?" he murmured, shaking his head. Inside, the silence settled again, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer tense. It was thick with awe, a mixture of disbelief and wonder. People sat straighter, some nervously adjusting their notes, but there. Attention was drawn inevitably back to the back row, and a little boy, whose innocence had undone the rigid atmosphere of the room. Claire whispered again to Liam, "Honey, you can't," but she stopped, realizing he wasn't going to stop, nor should he. He had done nothing wrong in the eyes of the heart, and she found herself softening, caught between embarrassment and awe. The prosecutors and defense attorneys resumed speaking, but their words sounded hollow compared to the simple, pure connection that had just occurred. The judge attempted to regain full control, clearing his throat, adjusting his glasses, and speaking with authority, but the tail wagging, the gentle whine, and the child's wide-eyed satisfaction lingered in the room like an invisible perfume. Some jurors tried to focus on their notes, but they found themselves stealing glances at Rex. One older man, his hands folded tightly on his lap, whispered to his neighbor, "You know, I think that dog just reminded us all what really matters." The neighbor chuckled softly. "For a minute, I forgot we were even in a courtroom." Even the officers at the side, trained to maintain stoicism at all times, allowed their expressions to soften. One muttered quietly, "I've worked with Rex for years. Never thought I'd see him like this." Daniels didn't respond, his eyes still trained on the boy and the dog, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. The other children who had come with parents, or dragged along by circumstance, watched wide-eyed, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing it was extraordinary. The room seemed warmer somehow, lighter, as though the heavy formality had lifted, replaced by a sense of shared humanity. Finally, after several long beats, Judge Harper cleared his throat again. This time, there was a faint smile on his face. Barely perceptible, but undeniable. "Let's proceed," he said slowly, "though I think we all need a moment to appreciate unexpected events." He gestured vaguely toward the back row. The words were unusual in their hesitancy, yet the meaning was clear. This would be remembered. Claire finally exhaled, though her hands remained on Liam's shoulders. She whispered softly, "You didn't get in trouble, honey. The dog, he liked what you said." Liam's eyes lit up further, a small, satisfied smile stretching across his face. He had succeeded. Not in obeying rules, not in sitting quietly, but in reaching out across a divide that adults had sworn could not be crossed. And Rex, still sitting, still composed, yet soft, gave another subtle wag, a final acknowledgement. The dog, the legend, the uncheckable, had responded to it. Single phrase, "Good boy." It was more than the room could process at once. Lawyers, jurors, parents, and officers would all remember this day, not for the verdicts, the evidence, or the arguments, but for a moment when the rigid walls of law were pierced by the innocence of a child and the unexpected warmth of a dog. The story, though silent to most, had been written in the minds of everyone present, and it would be retold countless times. A tale of a small boy, a legendary canine, and the extraordinary way too. Simple words could echo louder than any gavel in history. The gavel rested heavy and silent on the judge's bench, as though it too were unsure how to proceed. Judge Harper leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing in disbelief. In his decades presiding over this courthouse, he had encountered every type of human drama imaginable: shouting witnesses, tears in jurors' eyes, arguments that had escalated into near fisticuffs. He had navigated anger, grief, deception, and confusion, but nothing had ever stunned him as much as a small 3-year-old boy uttering 2 words that elicited a wag from a legendary canine. For a long moment, he simply stared. His hand hovered over the gavel, unsure whether to restore order or simply let the moment exist. He could hear the faint shuffle of papers, the creak of benches, the almost imperceptible breaths of jurors leaning forward in quiet awe. The courtroom had gone silent, not expectant, but suspended in something that felt larger than law, something human. Judge Harper adjusted his glasses and blinked slowly, forcing himself to process the situation. His mind, trained for logic and procedure, tried to reassert control. A child spoke in the courtroom. A dog responded. This isn't standard protocol. Yet even as he thought it, a part of him resisted the need to return immediately to order. There was a kind of magic in the air, and he knew instinctively that it should not be broken. He cleared his throat softly, a small attempt at authority that fell halfway between command and hesitation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said carefully, "let us proceed." His voice carried the weight of formality, but even he could hear the tremor in it, betraying amusement and disbelief. The jurors shifted slightly, glancing at one another. Some smiled quietly, their pens paused in midair. One middle-aged man whispered to the woman beside him, "I've seen a lot in this room, but never that." She nodded, lips pressed together, to hold back laughter, eyes still on the child in the back row. Lawyers adjusted papers, cleared throats, and muttered under their breaths. They had witnessed disruptions before, but never one so pure, so unexpected, and so utterly disarming. The defense attorney muttered to his colleague, "I don't know whether to object or just appreciate it." The prosecutor simply shook her head, a small grin tugging at her lips as she returned to her notes. Rex, still seated at the front of the room, maintained his composure outwardly, but the subtle wag of his tail hinted at a softer presence, an acknowledgement of the child's words. Officer Daniels observed the dog carefully, noting the momentary shift in posture. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Years of training, countless hours of discipline, yet Rex had revealed something no one could predict. He had a heart, and it had recognized innocence. Judge Harper exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had gripped the room begin to soften. He glanced down at the child, Liam, who sat wide-eyed, proud, and oblivious to the chaos he had caused. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. Harper could not help but smile faintly, a softness creeping into the stern lines of his face. For a brief moment, the judge allowed himself to reflect on what he had seen. Courtrooms were usually a place of rules, authority, and measured emotion. Witnesses testified, lawyers argued, and verdicts were delivered. And yet here, in the midst of procedure, a child had reminded everyone present that the human heart mattered. As much as evidence that innocence could disarm even the most disciplined of guardians, and that kindness was its own form of law. He cleared his throat again, this time more deliberately. "Let it be noted," he said slowly, "that the events that just occurred are highly irregular, yet there is a lesson in them, one that I believe we can all appreciate." His voice carried warmth now, a rare vulnerability that seemed to fill the cavernous chamber. The courtroom responded subtly. Heads nodded, shoulders relaxed, and even the stenographer paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The rigidity that had defined the morning lifted slightly, replaced by a shared recognition of something unspoken yet profound. Claire, sitting in the back, felt her body relax in tandem with the room. Her hands, which had gripped Liam's shoulders tightly, loosened. She leaned down and whispered softly, "See, honey, everyone's okay. The dog liked what you said." Liam, unaware of the magnitude of his actions, merely beamed, satisfied that Rex had heard him and approved. Judge Harper allowed himself a longer pause, letting the room breathe. "Proceed," he said finally, more firmly this time. But even as the lawyers began to speak again, the atmosphere was altered. The words that followed the evidence, the objections, the testimony were still important, but they carried less weight in the presence of something so simple, so genuine, and yet so transformative. He watched Rex, noting the subtle tilt of his head toward Liam, the quiet acknowledgement of the bond formed in a single fleeting moment. He realized, with a quiet humility, that even decades of experience and authority could not predict every outcome in a human and sometimes animal interaction. Some lessons came from the most unlikely sources: a child, a dog, and two words that echoed louder than any gavel. The jurors, too, were affected. One middle-aged woman who had arrived that morning stiff with tension, leaned back and exhaled, feeling a small smile tug at her lips. The case on the docket, the arguments of lawyers, even the weight of responsibility that had felt crushing moments before all, seemed less intimidating now. The reminder of innocence and simplicity had lifted a quiet burden. Even the attorneys, trained for decades to maintain composure, were not immune. The defense attorney's colleague whispered, "I think we just witnessed something. I don't know, human." The prosecutor's jaw tightened, not in disapproval, but in reluctant acknowledgement of the moment's impact. Outside the courthouse, time seemed to slow slightly, though no one noticed. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. Where tension had ruled, a gentle warmth now lingered. Where strict formality had dominated, a quiet humanity had been restored. And at the center of it all, a 3-year-old boy and a disciplined canine had reminded everyone present of the simplest truth: kindness resonates, even in the most unlikely places. Judge Harper finally lowered his pen, adjusting his glasses one last time. He exhaled a quiet laugh, the kind reserved for moments that feel too improbable to be real. He looked down at Liam, at the child who had spoken 2 small words, and then at Rex, the dog who had answered them. "Very well," he murmured to himself, a rare softness in his tone. "Let us continue. But let this serve as a reminder. Sometimes, even in law, we must remember the heart." And with that, the courtroom began its formal proceedings again. Papers shuffled, pens scribbled, lawyers argued, witnesses testified. But the memory of that pause, the unspoken acknowledgement between child and dog, between innocence and discipline, between human and animal remained. It lingered in the room like a faint light, a subtle reminder that no amount of law or order could contain the power of a single, genuine connection. Even as the day wore on, and cases were heard, and rulings made, those present would carry. A moment with them. A story they would tell quietly, perhaps with laughter, perhaps with awe. A story that began with two small words, a wag of a tail, and the pause of a judge who realized that sometimes the courtroom was bigger than law. It was humanity. The courtroom, once rigid with formality and tension, now carried an unmistakable lightness. It was subtle at first, a lowered shoulder here, a softened expression there, a juror daring to smile behind a notebook. The air itself seemed less heavy, as though the walls aged stone and polished wood had absorbed the warmth of the moment and released it gently back into the room. Judge Harper sat upright in his chair, pen resting lightly on the bench. His expression was no longer one of command alone, but of quiet reflection. The gavel, usually a sharp punctuation mark in the rhythm of the day, now seemed almost ceremonial, a reminder of order without suppressing humanity. He had seen the transformation firsthand, and though he didn't voice it aloud, he felt the shift. Courtrooms were rarely spaces for tenderness, but today, one small voice had reminded everyone present that they were, above all, human. Across the room, the jurors leaned slightly forward, papers and pens forgotten for a moment. One young man, a local teacher, whispered under his breath to his neighbor, "I didn't expect to feel that," like the room itself softened. The neighbor, a woman with a crease-lined face, nodded, her lips pressed together to hide a small smile. "It's remarkable," she replied. "All it took was a child saying something true." At the back, Liam sat proudly, his tiny chest rising with satisfaction. He had spoken, and the dog had responded. That was all that mattered. Claire's hands rested gently on his small shoulders, no longer tense but supporting, allowing him to sit in the moment he had created. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "He's extraordinary." Rex, ever the sentinel, remained at the front of the room, but there was a new softness in his posture. The subtle wag of his tail lingered longer this time, his amber eyes occasionally flicking toward the back row where Liam sat. The bond between the boy and the dog was unspoken yet undeniable, a thread of recognition stretching across the polished floor. Officer Daniels noticed it immediately and allowed himself a private smile, understanding that this connection, so rare, so genuine, was something even years of training could not manufacture. The lawyers adjusted their notes, resumed speaking. Yet their tone had changed imperceptibly. Arguments were delivered with precision, but a quiet warmth threaded through their voices, a recognition that the room had witnessed something larger than law. A normally curt objection from the defense attorney carried a faint hesitation, as though the adult in him had absorbed a lesson in humility from a child. Even the court staff, long accustomed to strict procedure, had shifted. The bailiff, Miller, leaned slightly forward, as if drawn into the story unfolding before him. He whispered to a clerk, "Never thought I'd see a courtroom like this. Not in 50 years. The clerk nodded, shaking her head in agreement, fingers still poised over the stenography keyboard. "It's different. Better somehow." The effect rippled through the room, subtle but undeniable. Witnesses who entered the courtroom after Liam's words found themselves greeted by an atmosphere less intimidating, less formal. One nervous man, called to testify about a minor theft, shifted his weight and muttered, "It doesn't feel so heavy anymore," as if the invisible tension of judgment had been lifted just enough to make him breathe easier. Even the children in attendance seemed affected. They watched Liam and Rex, wide-eyed, learning an unspoken lesson in courage, connection, and the profound power of kindness. One little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why did the dog wag his tail like that?" Her mother, unsure herself, simply said, "Because sometimes good hearts recognize each other." The girl nodded solemnly, as though the truth of it resonated even in her young mind. At the front, Judge Harper cleared his throat again, ready to resume formal proceedings. Yet his eyes lingered for a fraction longer on Liam and Rex. "We will continue," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "But let this moment remind us all, there is more to justice than words on paper. There is humanity, and there is the truth found in the smallest acts." The courtroom absorbed the sentiment. Some jurors shifted in their seats, pens moving once more, but with renewed attention. Lawyers exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the unusual lesson they had witnessed. Even the stenographer tapped her keys more deliberately, as though the narrative she recorded now carried an extra layer of significance. Claire watched Liam closely, noting the subtle change in his posture. He no longer leaned forward with urgent anticipation, but sat back, calm and content. The child's innocence had created a bridge between discipline and warmth, authority and understanding. She couldn't have predicted it, and she certainly hadn't planned it, but she marveled at it, feeling a swell of pride and awe. Rex, too, seemed aware that something had shifted. His gaze remained vigilant, scanning the room, yet there was a gentleness in his eyes, a recognition that the room had been softened by something far beyond procedure. Officer Daniels kept a light hand on the leash, sensing that the dog was in harmony with the energy of the room, a rare and delicate balance that required no command. Even the hardened adults, those who had lived long enough to see cynicism as a shield, found themselves touched. The farmer in the second row, who had spent decades in fields and barns, felt his lips curl into a quiet smile. "I've been through storms, argued over crops, and dealt with all manner of trouble," he murmured to his neighbor. "But nothing quite like this." His neighbor nodded, voice soft. "It's a reminder that the world still holds surprises, even here." The morning passed with a subtle hum, the courtroom carrying out its duties, yet transformed by the shared experience. Witnesses were called, evidence presented, objections made, but beneath it all, a memory of two simple words, a wagging tail. And a child's courage lingered. It was a quiet revolution, imperceptible in the procedures, but undeniable in the hearts of all present. At one point, a young attorney glanced toward Liam and Rex, whispering to a colleague, "Do you think they realize what they've done? That one moment can change the way we all see things?" A colleague smiled faintly. "I think so. Some lessons don't need explanations. You just feel them." Liam, seated in the back, occasionally glanced toward the front, exchanging small, silent acknowledgments with Rex. Each wag, each tilt of the head, reinforced the bond between them. No one else needed to understand. It was enough that the connection existed, visible and undeniable, bridging the world of a toddler and a trained K9. Claire, observing the quiet dignity of the moment, felt a shift within herself as well. The initial embarrassment had melted into gratitude. She realized that this morning, something extraordinary had unfolded before her eyes. A simple act of bravery, a child speaking from his heart, had changed the emotional landscape of the courthouse. The officers at the side, usually silent, observers of routine, exchanged subtle glances. "I've seen Rex respond to lots of situations," one whispered, "but never like this. Not because of fear, not because of training, because of something real." Daniels merely nodded, understanding fully that this was a rare intersection of instinct, innocence, and trust. Even the judge, who had resumed reading a file, couldn't resist glancing toward the back periodically. He had presided over countless TRILs, yet the lesson of humility, wonder, and human connection struck deeper than any verdict could. He allowed himself a quiet smile, the kind that softened the stern lines of age and authority, and made the chamber feel, for a fleeting moment, less like a courtroom and more like a shared space for understanding. Time moved forward, but the atmosphere remained softened. The tension of formalities was tempered by a gentle warmth, a quiet acknowledgement that the extraordinary had occurred and could not be undone. Every adult, witness and observer carried the imprint of what they had seen, and the memory would linger far longer than the proceedings themselves. By the end of the morning, as the gavel struck to signal a brief recess, the room had transformed. Conversations in the hallway carried a lighter tone. Smiles appeared where there had been furrowed brows, and even the children found themselves emboldened to observe the world with curiosity rather than caution. And at the center of it all, Liam and Rex remained connected in ways words could not capture. A child's innocence had softened the hearts of a room full of adults, and a dog's response had confirmed the power of simple, genuine connection. The courthouse had returned to its duties, yet it would never be the same. Those present would carry the memory of the moment, a reminder that in the midst of procedure, formality, and order, humanity had the power to shine through. The courthouse was quieter than usual as the afternoon sun streamed through the tall, arched windows, casting long stripes of light across the polished floor. The gavel had struck for the last time that morning, signaling the temporary recess. But the echoes of what had occurred lingered like a delicate fragrance. The room had returned to routine, yet the routine felt irrevocably altered. Something profound had taken root, quietly but unmistakably, in the hearts of everyone present. Liam, seated at the back, rocked slightly on the bench, small hands clasped. In his lap, his eyes, wide and curious, occasionally flicked toward the front of the room, where Rex remained poised like a silent sentinel. Despite the lessons of earlier that morning, the boy felt no fear, only awe and delight. The dog had acknowledged him. The legend had softened for a moment, and in that acknowledgement lay a magic impossible to explain to adults who had forgotten how to see the world with wonder. Claire, seated beside him, watched him closely. Her hands rested lightly on his small shoulders, no longer tense or restraining. She allowed him the space to savor the moment, realizing that the small boy had accomplished something adults rarely did. He had reminded everyone present that the simplest gestures, 2 words, a wag of a tail, could resonate farther than any law, argument, or procedure. Officer Daniels remained at the front, standing casually yet with the same quiet authority he always carried. He studied Rex, who had returned to his disciplined stance, but still carried a subtle softness in his amber eyes. Daniels's hand rested lightly on the leash, acknowledging that the connection between dog and child was now unspoken yet enduring. He allowed himself a private smile, understanding the rarity of what had transpired. Few humans would ever witness it. Fewer still would appreciate its depth. The judge, Judge Harper, returned to his bench after the brief recess, adjusting his robe and glasses. His expression had softened, the stern lines of authority tempered by the memory of the morning's events. He glanced over the courtroom, noting the subtle smiles of jurors, the relaxed postures of attorneys, and the general shift in energy. The law still demanded attention, but now it was accompanied by an unexpected warmth, a reminder that justice, though structured, existed in a human context. As the proceedings resumed, there was a noticeable difference in the way adults interacted with one another. The earlier tension that had stiffened the room like iron rails had melted into something gentler. Attorneys spoke with a quieter precision. Jurors leaned forward with engaged curiosity rather than anxious apprehension, and even the court staff moved with a lighter step. It was as though a collective breath had been released, a subtle, shared acknowledgement of the extraordinary moment that had occurred earlier. Liam remained attentive to Rex, his eyes reflecting wonder and pride. He had spoken, and the dog had responded. That simple exchange had bridged the gap between innocence and discipline, between curiosity and authority, in a way that adults had been too rigid to imagine. The boy's confidence had grown, But more importantly, he had learned something fundamental. His voice mattered, even when small. Rex, ever vigilant, continued to scan the room, but there was now a quiet warmth in his demeanor. His tail twitched occasionally, a subtle acknowledgement of the boy in the back row. Officer Daniels noticed it and allowed the leash to remain loose, trusting the bond that had been formed. In training, a dog like Rex could follow orders flawlessly, respond to threats with unwavering focus, and remain calm amid chaos. But this connection with a child was something beyond training. It was instinct, empathy, and recognition rolled into one. The judge called the next witness, a man who had been scheduled for a routine testimony. He entered the room, nervously, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. Normally, the courthouse air would have felt oppressive, suffocating. Today, it felt different. The lingering energy of earlier events seemed to reassure him subtly, and he offered a small, tentative smile. Even without understanding the entire story, he sensed that the room was lighter, more human. Claire watched Liam as he observed the proceedings. The boy's attention was divided between Rex and the witness, a careful balancing act of curiosity and admiration. She realized that this morning had changed something fundamental in him. The interaction had not only bridged a gap between child and dog, but had also taught Liam the quiet power of courage and the impact of words spoken from the heart. Across the courtroom, murmurs floated between jurors, quiet enough not to disrupt proceedings but audible enough to reveal their shared fascination. One juror whispered, "I can't believe how calm he is." The dog and the boy. Another nodded, adding, "It's humbling. Really makes you think about patience and understanding." Their observations were casual but heartfelt, a reflection of the subtle transformation that had swept through the room. Even the attorneys, trained to focus solely on evidence and argumentation, found themselves influenced. The prosecutor paused mid-sentence, momentarily distracted by the image of Rex sitting silently, attentive but softened. She composed herself quickly, continuing her argument, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. The defense attorney, too, found his focus occasionally drifting toward the pair in the back row, a quiet acknowledgement of something larger than the case itself. As the day wore on, the courtroom became a space where routine and wonder coexisted. Legal documents were read, testimonies given, and objections made, but all carried an undercurrent of human warmth. Adults, trained to separate emotion from procedure, were now reminded that their work existed in a human context. The presence of Liam and Rex had introduced something intangible yet undeniable, a reminder that empathy, connection, and genuine recognition could resonate even in the most formal of environments. During a brief break, several jurors gathered near the back, quietly discussing what had happened. "I've been in courts for years," one remarked, "but I've never seen anything like that. A boy, a dog. It changed the energy of the entire room." Another nodded, adding, "It's true. You can't put your finger on why, but you just feel it. It's like a reset. You see people and the world differently." Even Judge Harper, during a private moment before returning to the bench, reflected quietly on the morning's events. He realized that the lessons were subtle but profound. Humanity existed even within the confines of law, and moments of connection could illuminate truths no legal argument could fully capture. A child's voice, unguarded and genuine, had reminded everyone present that beneath procedure and formality lay the potential for warmth, understanding, and shared recognition. When the day finally drew to a close, the courthouse slowly emptied. Lawyers gathered their papers, jurors exchanged polite farewells, and the staff began their routine cleaning and organization. Yet the memory of the morning remained alive in the minds of all present. The echo of Liam's voice, the soft wag of Rex's tail, and the pause of the judge had created a story that would be retold countless times, an anecdote of innocence, discipline, and the extraordinary power of simple words. Claire gathered Liam in her arms, holding him close. "You were very brave today," she whispered, stroking his hair gently. The boy smiled, a bright, unself-conscious grin that spoke more than words could convey. He had made a difference, even in a small way, and he knew it. Rex, still standing patiently by Officer Daniels, gave a single measured wag of his tail before settling back into his disciplined stance. It was as if the dog understood that his role had expanded slightly that day, not only guardian and law enforcement partner, but also witness to innocence and bridge between worlds. Officer Daniels patted Rex's head lightly, a gesture that conveyed both pride and understanding. "You did well, partner," he murmured. Rex's ears flicked, and his amber eyes met Liam's one last time before the K9 was guided toward the exit. The connection lingered, silent but palpable, a bond forged in 2 words and a moment of courage. As they left the courthouse, the sunlight spilling over the steps seemed warmer, gentler. Claire held Liam's hand, guiding him down the steps, while the murmurs of the day's events began to ripple through the streets outside. Passers-by would later hear fragments of the story. A little boy said 2 words to a dog, and wonder at the extraordinary in the ordinary. For Liam, the day was simple. He had spoken, and the dog had responded. But for everyone else, the jurors, the lawyers, the judge, the staff, the lesson lingered. Humanity, empathy, and recognition had found their place in a courtroom. And sometimes it took the smallest voice, the quietest courage, to remind adults of what truly mattered. The story of the 3-year-old and the K9 would live on in memory, quietly shaping perspectives, softening hearts, and inspiring whispers of wonder whenever recounted. And as the courthouse doors closed behind them, it was clear that the echoes of that morning, 2 words, a wag and a pause, would resonate far beyond the walls of law.